guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Ilenia and this is Softskill.Atelier, where I teach you all the skills you need to bring your fashion ideas to life, from concept to completion. Today's video is part number 2 of our basic sewing introduction series, and I can tell you already so much. We are going to sew on a sewing machine for the first time. Today we are looking into 7 of the most common seams you can sew on every household sewing machine. We will be ending up with a small sample selection of different seams you can use as a reference for future projects. If you have not watched the first video of my sewing introduction series, I will put the link in the description below so you can follow a step-by-step tutorial on how to set up a sewing machine so you're ready for today's session. Let's get started. This video is structured with a quick overview over all the tools and materials you need on today's session. Then we look into 5 ground rules you should be familiar with when you want to learn how to sew. And last but not least, I'm going to show you 7 of the most common seams you can sew on every household sewing machine. The seams are basic seam, the top stitch, the fake denim seam, the zigzag frame seam, the French seam, the piped seam allowance or Hong Kong seam, the piping in between seams. If you look at your clothes, you will quickly realize that there is more than one way we can sew fabrics together, and there are multiple reasons why. First of all, a seam can influence the aesthetic of your garment drastically, and depending on your seam, it can even change a garment style completely. Depending on how complex the finishing of a seam is, you can tell quite a bit about the quality and the price of a garment. So if you know a little bit about seams, it seems sometimes more interesting to examine the inside of clothes than solely look at its appearance from the outside. The second reason why we need different seams is we need to deal with the raw edges of the seam allowance. The seam allowance is that excess fabric you need on the edges of your cut-out pieces, so you have a bit extra space to not sew right on the edge of the fabric. Depending on your fabric, the edges tend to fray easily, so we need to make sure we prevent them from fraying by covering the edges or sew another seam on top to stop the fraying. The third reason is durability and material of the garment. Depending on the fabric, we also need to choose our seam by how strong and durable an item needs to be. An outdoor worker pants needs to be much more strong than a silky blouse, so we need to choose the seams accordingly. Before we get started, I want to give you a quick overview over all the materials and tools we need for today's session. This video is a basic sewing introduction and we don't want to get overwhelmed by picking a challenging fabric. I highly recommend picking a light cotton fabric for the beginning. Cotton is a beginner-friendly fabric because it does not really have much of a life of its own and isn't too slippery and flexible. If you have an old non-stretchy shirt or some other lightweight non-stretchy cotton piece laying around, I encourage you to reuse materials instead of buying new fabrics. An old button-down shirt would be ideal. Ideally, you have 2 different fabrics with 2 different colors so you can create some contrast on seam number 6 and 7. I will use some scraps for my face mask production from this spring during the first lockdown. Of course, you need your sewing machine. It does not need to be anything fancy or expensive. For today, we only need a straight stitch, and for one seam we will be using the zigzag function. Yarn for your sewing machine. Sewing yarns come in different thickness. As a standards for sewing machine, use something between number 100 and number 120. As higher the number goes, as thinner the yarn will be. To get your seams neat, we need to press them with an iron. In case you don't have any at hand, make sure your fabric is definitely made out of cotton because cotton can easily be creased with your fingernails. Pins. We need some pins to hold the fabric together while cutting and sewing. Fabric marker. You need something to mark your fabric. There's a variety of different markers with different qualities on the market. The great thing about fabric markers is that they will disappear after a while, either by washing, heat or friction. I'd recommend a classical tailor's chalks for today's task. If you don't have any of them, just use a regular pencil this time. Set square. To make sure your fabric pieces are straight, we use a set square. I recommend a transparent one to see what's underneath. Fabric scissors. Let's set this straight from the beginning. There are normal scissors and there are fabric scissors. Fabric scissors do usually have thicker and bigger blades. Fabric scissors will only, this is very important, only be used for fabrics. If you use them for anything else than fabric, the blade gets blunt very quick. And it's really not fun cutting fabric with unsharp scissors, so make sure you take good care of your personal fabric scissors. Seam ripper. If it all goes well, we don't need to reopen any seams, but it is better to have a seam ripper close by your workstation. Even the most experienced ones do make sewing mistakes. These are all the materials and tools we need for today's session. To be properly prepared for our first sewing session, I want to introduce you to a few ground rules I warmly recommend you to follow. We cut the fabric double layered, with the pretty side facing each other. If we get fabric from the store, fabrics for clothes are always folded in half so that you have 2 layers of fabric. And that's great, leave it like that, because we are going to need it that way. If you reuse and recycle scraps or old clothes, make sure you have your pieces prepared the way so you can lay the fabric you want to cut out in 2 layers. Why is that? The fabric is double layered because generally we make clothes that have 2 identical mirrored sides, 2 sleeves, 2 pockets, 2 legs, and so on. If we cut them out on a double layered fabric, we first of all can save some time, and second of all we will have pieces mirrored immediately. The pretty side of the fabric, the side that will be shown on the outside of your clothes, is usually the more delicate one, and definitely the side we want to keep as fresh and clean as possible during the whole sewing process. Make sure that this side stays as little influenced by the marker, iron, sewing machine and other influences. So we will always, with a few exceptions, work on the back side of the fabric. Never forget your seam allowance, mark your seam line. I tend to say that a lot in my classes, but seam allowance is very important and can never be forgotten. To have a bit of extra fabric next to your seam. It is usually between 1 centimeter, 1/3 of an inch, and 2 centimeters, 2/3 of an inch. I recommend 1 centimeter as a standard. So some patterns do have a seam allowance, but usually you need to add your seam allowance on your pattern. We mark the fabric before we cut. Before we cut any kind of fabric, we mark the exact line we want to cut along with our marker of choice. And we also mark the second line 1 centimeter next to it. That is the line we're going to sew on. This seems quite a bit of extra work, but it is worth it because it just makes everything more precise and prevents you from mistakes later on the sewing process. Before we cut the fabric, we need to make sure that the 2 layers of fabric won't move around while cutting. Also, while sewing, it is important you make sure the fabrics won't move, so it is always a good idea to pin the 2 layers of fabric together with a few pins. As someone who is just starting out with sewing, putting pins in seems a bit of a struggle. That's why we look at the pinning process together. First, push your pin into the fabric. That's the easy part. Lift your fabric a tiny bit with your pin and use the other hand to push the fabric down around the area where the needle lifted the fabric. Now we can just push the needle through parallel to the table. Make sure the fabric will be held down onto the table the whole time. Only lift the fabric right at the spot where your pin is at. If you prepare your fabric for sewing, make sure you push the pin onto the fabric right at the line you're going to sew on. I recommend always pinning the fabric that way and never this way. This way it is much easier to take the pins off while sewing. So now I have talked enough and we're going to start with the 7 most common seams you can sew on a household sewing machine. We will end up having a big sample patch where each piece of fabric is sewn together with another seam. So first you go and cut out 8 pieces of fabric. These should all be the same size, about 20 by 12 centimeters. Don't forget to mark your seam allowance on 1 centimeter further in parallel to the cutting edge. Basic stitch. If you have your 8 pieces prepared, we go and start the first seam. Our first seam is the basic straight stitch. The one we all imagine is the one and only seam in the world until we look closer. Most of the more complex seam finishings also start off as a basic straight seam. Take 2 of the fabrics, place them on top of each other. Make sure the pretty sides are facing each other. Pin the fabric as I have instructed and then take it to the sewing machine. Make sure your stitch program is put on straight stitch with a stitch length of about 2.5 to 3 millimeters. Put your fabric between the feed dog and the presser foot. Make sure you are about 1 centimeter away from the beginning of the fabric. Hold your fabrics with the left hand and pull the hand wheel towards you so that the needle goes right into the fabric. Make sure the needle hits the marked line you are supposed to sew on. Put your presser foot down. Start sewing by pressing your foot pedal. Go slowly, stitch by stitch. After about 2 to 3 stitches, press the backward function and keep on sewing backward until you reach the beginning of the fabric. Sew slower than you think you should to constantly check 4 things. First, if the stitch looks regular. Second, if the fabric moves smoothly or if it feels somehow stuck. Third, if the distance between the needle and the edge of the fabric is always the same. Fourth, that the 2 fabrics lay flat on top of each other. On the end, you go backward around 2 to 3 stitches and sew forward to the end of the fabric again to lock the seam. Ta-da! First seam sewn. To finish up the sewing process, we are going to press out the seam allowance to make the seam look neat and crisp. The top stitch comes in different variations. It basically attaches the loose seam allowance to the rest of the fabric by top stitching additional lines on top of the fabric. We all know this kind of stitching and find it almost everywhere, like for example on shoulder seams of t-shirts, on jackets, pants, etc. You can also use these extra visible stitches to create an aesthetic accent on your designs. For the top stitch seam, we repeat the basic stitch. We simply sew the next piece of our cutout fabric onto our sample patch by following the same instructions than we did before. If you're done with that, you have your nicely pressed sample patch piece in front of you. Now you start sewing top stitches right and left from the middle seam. Make sure the distance between the new stitch and the middle seam stays always the same. There are a few guidelines on your machine that help you to keep the stitches straight. You can also use the edges of your presser foot as a guideline. The next stitch resembles the ones we know from jeans and other solid outdoor clothes. It basically triples the durability by the extra 2 top stitches. I say resemble because the real denim stitch does look exactly like that from the outside. The inside is done a bit differently by the textile industry. But today we will focus on stitches you can do at home on your sewing machine. That's why we will look at the fake denim top stitch. We again take the next piece of our prepared fabric and first attach it to our sample patch with a basic seam. This fake denim stitch is also a top stitch, but this time we need to press both sides of the seam allowance to one side. And the 2 top stitches we make both on the same side, meaning they are both stitched on the same fabric. The first top stitch you sew only 2 or 3 millimeters away from the main seam. As a guideline, I like to use the inside of my presser foot. For the second top stitch, I use the outside edge of the presser foot. This seam gives you the illusion as if the piece of fabric with the top stitches on lays higher than the one side without any stitches. French seam. The French seam is more seen in couture pieces, and it deserves its status as a couture seam because it manages to hide away all the raw fabric edges, which makes it very intriguing for transparent and sheer fabrics on high quality clothes without lining. So take the next piece of fabric, and this time it all goes the reversed way. This time the 2 fabrics should face each other with the left side, and we are going to sew our first seam on the pretty side, right on the edge of the fabric, about 2.5 to 3 millimeters away from the edge. Sew slowly and try to make the seam as straight as possible. Then we press the seam, first flat, and in the second step we fold the fabric right where the seam is, so that the pretty sides now are facing each other. Now we sew a second seam about 0.7 centimeters next to the folded new fabric edge. So now when we turn around the fabric to the right side, we shouldn't see any of the fabric edges peeking through the second seam. Everything should be nicely wrapped. Overlock or zigzag edges. The easiest way to prevent seam allowances from fraying is to frame the edges of a basic stitch with some sort of additional stitch. In the industry, you find most clothes being framed with a special stitch called overlock. For an overlock stitch, you need an extra machine which solely is used to make that stitch. Since we are focusing on a regular household sewing machine on this video, I'm going to show you some alternative stitch you can use to replace the overlock stitch. The most common stitch you could use is a zigzag. A zigzag is a standard function on every household machine. Depending on the model, you can choose between different lengths and change width, or you can simply switch between different pre-programmed versions of the zigzag. For the covering of the edges, choose a tight zigzag with long stitches, so it mimics the quality of an overlock seam. Some household machines also have real overlock alternatives that look very similar to the original stitch. Feel free to try them all and see which one you prefer. When you frame the fabric with a zigzag or similar, I recommend making the frames before you sew the pieces of fabric together. The next seam, we are basically just wrapping the edges of the seam allowance with an additional piece of fabric. These seams you come across in a lot of higher quality pieces like coats and suit pants, where you don't have any lining but the inside needs to look crisp. The technique to use some extra fabric to cover the edges is called piping. The piping can be in two different variations. You can either wrap each side of the seam allowance individually or both together. The fabric we need for the piping is called bias tape. It is a stripe of fabric cut diagonal to the fabric grain line. So the fabric has no stability and can easily be bent in multiple directions without creating any folds. We are going to look at how to prepare some bias tape by ourselves. Take some of your fabric. Maybe you have an extra scrap of a different color. So if you look at your fabric closely, you can usually see the direction the yarns are woven. Now take your ruler and marker and draw a diagonal line to it. Then draw another line 3 cm next to it and cut it out. You go and press a middle line into your band by folding it and go over it with your iron. Reopen your folded band and now fold the edges of the band towards your middle fold you just have created. Last, repress your middle fold and your bias tape is finished. Now we want to sew the bias tape onto the edges of the seam allowance. We will create the version where you wrap both seam allowance sides into one piping. So for this seam, we won't need to press your basic stitch before we continue because we want the two seam allowance sides to stick together. Now take your bias tape and unfold it on one side and pin it together with the seam allowances. Sew them together on the first fold of the bias tape. Then fold the rest of the tape over the seam allowance and attach the side with a top stitch. The last seam for today's video is again a basic stitch where we put an extra piece of fabric in between to create some extra contrast and contour to the seam. Again, cut yourself a piece of bias band, this time only 2.5 cm wide. Soften the band and put it in between the two pieces of fabric you are going to sew together. The open edges facing the same direction than the edges of the two fabrics. Now, just sew your normal basic seam line with a straight stitch and press it flat. That is 7 of the most common seams you can sew on a household sewing machine. Obviously there are many more out there and eventually you will get to know them too. But for now, go and practice the seams I showed you today. You can also combine the seams I showed you and add a top stitch to a piped seam or zigzag the edges of your last seam. Please keep the sample patch so we can get back to it on upcoming tutorials. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you could learn something from it. If you managed to create the seams, I'm more than happy to see your results. Share them by tagging Softskill.Atelier on Instagram or YouTube. If you like this video, please let me know with a thumbs up and make sure you don't miss any of the upcoming videos by subscribing to Softskill.Atelier channel.